Jeannette Acevedo, Rivera, and I think I'm going to sit there if I do your PowerPoint.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Sí, por favor.
Sí,
ella va a pasar.
Bueno, pero puedes pasar, no, sí, pues,
No sé. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, if it's easier with the.
yeah. Now I can do it with them.
Okay,
That's
okay.
fine.
Thank you. No es este.
I need it. Can I?
It's, Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on this rainy morning, and thank you to the organizers for all of your work. Yeah. Okay. In the current world, which is determined by virtual realities and electronic exchanges, attention is undeniably a significant asset. We do our best to split our attention among the work email, the terrible news, the student submissions we must grade, the funny post on social media, and the digitized document from a remote archive. But what seems to receive most of our attention is inevitably people, what other people are doing, thinking, eating, and especially how other people interact with us and react to our own cybernetic presence. This obsession with attention is not exclusive of the virtually determined 21st century reality, in which the existence of acronyms such as IRL, remind us of the fragmentation in our daily interactions. Over the next minutes, I will take you back in time to explore the development of the album phenomenon in 19th century France and Spain. Through an interdisciplinary analysis of the contents of archival albums, I proved that the craving for attention is not a contemporary fixation, and that our homologues 2 centuries ago also suffered from the FOMO, or fear of missing out, created by social networks. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, the notion of album came to describe books with blank pages in which owners collected contributions in the form of poetry, drawings, or music scores created for them by acquaintances, friends, or even suitors, who were ideally well-known artists in their milieu. It was expected that those entries celebrated the physical and moral attributes of album owners. Although I have found some exceptions to this in my archival research, album dynamics were generally determined by stereotypical gender roles, in which women were consumers who owned albums and gathered entries, and men were producers who contributed to them. In her study of the album practice in England, Samantha Matthews points out that by the end of the 1780s, this trend, and I quote, and its close association with occasional poetry and poetics had acquired a broad cultural currency among the upper and middle classes and was highly marketable, end of quote. The chronology seems to have been similar in France, as in 1811, French social customs writer Victor Joseph Étienne de Jouy published an essay about the excessive popularity of the album and the hassle that it had become for male contributors. According to Jouy, albums had been invented for the happiness of one sex and the despair of the other, an observation that clearly establishes the gender division in the exchange. In Spain, the album was scrutinized as a cultural practice decades later, in 1835, when costumbrista Mariano José de Larra wrote an essay about it being all the rage. Larra echoes Jouy's criticism about the unequal distribution of roles in the album dynamic by denouncing that all the inconveniences were imposed upon those responsible for taking from it, page by page, the quality of whiteness. Notwithstanding this perceived division of roles in the album, we will see that all participants in the exchange had the shared goal of receiving attention from others. I have consulted 37 albums in public and private collections, libraries, and archives in France and Spain, a sample that elucidates this phenomenon's significance in its context. Today, I will examine the album as a social network that foresaw many of the dynamics that we can identify in contemporary communication platforms. Using literary contributions from archival albums, I explore the individual interests and goals of participants in this gender-driven trend and explain how it allows for a reconstruction of multiple social and cultural transactions. In the same way that in 1 or 2 centuries, researchers will be able to understand an array of facets of our 21st century lives by analyzing our exchanges on social media, it is possible to explore multiple aspects of French and Spanish 19th century societies by examining the album phenomenon. In that sense, the album could be considered a predecessor to today's online social networks, as it promoted similar types of exchanges, albeit with more rigid gender roles. Here, I approach the album from the perspective of the attention economy, a contemporary theory applied to internet size and mass media, which refers to the tendency to value attention in economic terms, transforming it into a type of currency. A person who can attract attention to their social network profile will be, according to this concept, more valuable than others in that virtual space. As George Frank points out, attention exists in an inescapable cycle as, and I quote, nothing seems to attract more attention than the accumulation of attention income. Although the essential principle of the attention economy suggests that it could only materialize in the current mediatized world, Frank notes that, and I quote, the capitalization of attention income existed long before the media came into being. The 19th century album fashion proves that the desire for attention existed in other types of communication technologies and reflected the idiosyncrasies of those societies. In this exchange, the attention seeker was usually the woman who expected to collect the greatest number of laudatory contributions possible from renowned writers or artists. Interestingly, male contributors also craved attention in the album dynamic as they implicitly competed with one another through their album entries, which advanced their artistic status and allowed them to network. Thus, this phenomenon produced a bilateral attention economy from which both participants in the exchange benefited. In the following analysis, I will focus on 3 categories that show the circulation of attention in the album trend. Traditional contributions focused on the album owner and her moral and physical attributes, contributions dedicated to the owner's husband or father, and meta-referential contributions that turn attention to the album practice itself. An essential difference between the album and contemporary social networks is that access to the former was not as egalitarian as that of online platforms. For female album owners, participation in this trend implied an economic investment to purchase the luxurious books and a social investment by requesting the entries for their collection. Understandably, it was mainly the wives and daughters of writers and journalists who could actively engage in the album practice, as those women regularly interacted with potential contributors at social gatherings. This is the case of Madame d'Heredia, the wife of Parnassian poet José María de Heredia, whose album shows precisely how beneficial it was to be married to a man well-connected in literary circles in order to complete a collection. Many of the prominent contributors in Madame d'Heredia's album created traditional entries that focused on exalting her attributes. The contribution of late Romantic writer Jules Barbey d'Aurevilly does precisely that, while fulfilling her expectations and offering her the attention she was pursuing. And I quote, "What can I tell you, madame, in this immense album, the greatness of which resembles your own, to offer you the verses that maybe one thinks of, they will have to be beautiful, like you." The notion of grandeur evokes here the size of the book and Madame d'Heredia's moral superiority. Kept at the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal in Paris, Madame d'Heredia's is indeed a large album of 17 inches tall by 13 inches wide, with a striking cover and an impressive collection of more than 70 entries that reflect her husband's links to the Parnassian poetry movement. d'Aurevilly's contribution is concise, not because Madame d'Heredia fails to inspire more, but precisely because her beauty evokes outstanding verses that would perhaps require substantial time and effort to create. As a well-known writer, it is understandable that d'Aurevilly preferred to save his creative energies for his paid work. However, he does accomplish the specific goal of praising the album owner and even goes beyond the act of writing verses by merging the literary effort with a visual one, using red and gold ink in long strokes to script some of the letters. As he grants Madame d'Heredia the attention she sought through his literary and visual homage, he reiterates her inescapable link to the book. Although gendered, This notion of the album can be equated to the ways in which our social media pages represent us and invite others to celebrate our qualities. A typical form of transgression in the album exchange was to change the addressee of contributions and write entries that praised the owner's husbands or fathers. I identify this as the second category of contributions, those that mention the book's owners, but also redirect the attention awarded by contributors. In those cases, the transferred praise frequently highlighted the honor of having a wife or daughter like the album owner. Spanish writer Antonio Grillo did this in his 1886 contribution to the album belonging to Aurelia Picatoste. Grillo is quite generous in his tribute to the album owner while revealing the intervention of writer and journalist Felipe Picatoste in the process of collecting contributions for his daughter's album, an act that alters the typical album exchange in which the book owner gathered the contributions herself. The first lines of Grillo's stanza indicate that he is not the only contributor whose participation in that album is the result of the networks of Aurelia's father. And I quote, "With what happiness I inaugurate these first pages, whose whiteness reveals the image of your innocence. We, your father's friends, leave flowers upon them." Accepting the honor of being the first contributor to that album, Grillo emphasizes the whiteness of the book's pages, an observation that responds to the tendency to link the physical condition of the album with the moral status of its owner. Later in his poem, Grillo identifies Aurelia as her father's muse and adds that, and I quote, "Your father has the pleasure of contemplating your beauty, and I have another joy, that of knowing that you are good." Aurelia will certainly not stop being good once all of her father's friends' attention went to her in the form of contributions, thus staining her album's pages. As absurd as it seems to us now, 19th-century male critics of the album imposed this parallelism between the object and theme of virtue. The understanding of a shared male suffering prompted the tendency to create meta-referential entries that present the male perspective and focus on contributors' insecurities or humorously criticize the album practice. According to the rules of this craze, contributors should create something original for the owner of the book, praising her physical traits or moral virtues. Thus, this type of entry defied standard album dynamics, turning the attention to the album itself and creating, and I quote, "a stock exchange of attention capital similar to the one existing in contemporary networks." I identify these meta-referential contributions as a separate category and explore how they provide a behind-the-scenes look at the album as a social exchange. José Alcalá Galiano was somewhat known in the 19th century Spanish literary scene, and yet he experienced a panicked reaction upon seeing the names of the writers who had signed the album belonging to Mariana Paniagua before him. Like most album owners, Mariana was herself married to a writer, Eusebio Blasco y Soler, which guaranteed her contributions from other important literary figures of the time. In his contribution, dated 1877, Alcalá Galiano directly mentions some of these writers in order to validate the apprehension that overwhelms him when trying to create his poem. And I quote, "In such people, Campoamor, Zorrilla, Harsen, Buchayala, so many sublime poets, I will not go on, no sir, I will stay in the antechamber." Alcalá Galiano's use of the notion of walking or entering transforms the album into a metaphor for the salon typically used in the 19th century for artistic and literary encounters. If this had been an actual legal salon, Alcalá Galiano would not have entered, daunted by the ensemble of illustrious writers already in it. But in the album universe, he suffers a sudden attack of FOMO that forces him to make the sacrifice for Mariana. "But so you know I came, because I got to your door, I leave here, poor poet, my tangential autograph." Alcalá Galiano's entry may not be as valuable as that of the writers he mentioned before, yet it is beneficial for him to take the risk of entering that space. As Frank notes, no, it's the previous one.
Sorry.
That's fine. As Frank notes, it is possible to, and I quote, "work one's way up in the economy of attention just by persistently keeping at the heels of those who are better off." Alcalá Galiano pleases the female petition for a contribution while hoping that his effort will lead to the networking that a successful album intervention should provide. Although contributors criticize the album as an unfair practice that put pressure on them by demanding, sometimes on the spot, their creative production, they continued participating in this exchange because of the benefits it implied for their networking goals. A good example of this is French historian and politician Gabriel Anoto, who wrote in Madame Derrida's album, "One Should Never Write in Albums." Driven by the gender divisions in this phenomenon, his aversion toward the album fashion functions precisely as the ideological basis of his contribution. Anoto would have decided not to write in Madame Derrida's album, but he can't miss the opportunity of being featured in this exclusive collection. Similar to Anoto and other men who use their album entries to deride this phenomenon, those of us who continually complain about Facebook or Twitter always return because we miss the attention. We miss granting it and receiving it. We miss being part of something bigger than our mundane routines. The similarities between the album and contemporary social networks revolve mainly around the needs and goals of the individuals participating in these communication trends. Although there are differences between the two due to the class and gender constitution of the album and the online component of modern sites, both platforms aim ultimately to satisfy their users' desperate quest for attention. Their overflow of attention that in the 19th century ended up being redirected at the album in meta-referential entries is now focused on our fears of how electronic communication platforms track us and gather information about our lives. Notwithstanding these concerns, we continue to be there creating content for future researchers who will be curious about the exchanges we established on social media in the 21st century. Thank you for your attention.